Dear friends, welcome to our channel. We are very excited to share with you different stories about love and betrayal from around the world. So let's begin our story journey today. Rain was beating against the windows in the suburbs of Houston, Texas, as Blake awoke from his contemplation. His phone lit up with a brief message from his mother-in-law Helena. Family meeting at our house tomorrow at 3 p.m. Important matters to discuss. Adrian says you must attend. A surprise awaits you. Blake frowned. His marriage to Adrian had lasted 8 years, but in the last 6 months, everything had changed. As a petroleum engineer on an offshore drilling platform, he was accustomed to a rotation schedule of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. In the past, this work arrangement had never been a problem, until recently. He put down his phone and looked at the suitcase by the bedroom door. He had returned from sea just 3 days ago, hoping to repair his increasingly distant relationship with Adrian. However, she had been even colder, coming home late almost every night with the excuse of working overtime. Although she was a real estate agent, Blake knew perfectly well that no real estate agent would be showing houses to clients at 10 o'clock at night. Recalling their first meeting at a coffee shop in Houston, Blake had just returned from his rotation on the offshore platform. Adrian was processing documents for a client, and her smile and confidence immediately attracted him. 6 months later, they were married, and a year later they welcomed their daughter Mila, who is now 7 years old. Blake got up and went to the study, gently closing the door and taking out a folder from the safe behind the bookshelf. This purposely hidden folder contained all the evidence he had collected over the past 3 months. He never thought he would become the type of husband who investigated his wife, but when the suspicions increased, he had no choice. It all began 4 months ago when he returned from sea and found a receipt from an upscale restaurant they had never visited together. When he casually asked about it, Adrian stammered that it was a gathering with female colleagues, but the receipt showed only 2 glasses of wine and 2 main courses. Then came the mysterious credit card charges, hotel rooms, jewelry stores, men's clothing stores. When he inquired, Adrian always had explanations: client gifts, company reimbursements, charity auctions, but the justifications became increasingly far-fetched. And there were the phone calls, private conversations always taken in the bathroom, or calls that abruptly ended when Blake entered the room. What convinced him most was what happened 3 weeks ago. Blake finished his offshore work early and returned home to surprise Adrian. But the surprise was his. The house was empty, though Adrian's car was in the garage. He called her, and she said she was shopping at the mall. When she returned that night, her clothes had an unmistakable scent of men's cologne. Blake didn't confront her directly, but instead began carefully collecting evidence. He logged into the family cloud account and found text messages and photos that Adrian had deleted but were still in the cloud backup. He hired a private investigator to follow her and obtain decisive evidence. The folder contained photos, message records, bank statements, hotel receipts, and even several videos of Adrian and her lover intimately interacting in public places. But most shocking was the identity of her lover, Nathaniel, a prominent real estate developer and also a major client of the real estate company where Adrian worked. Married, with 3 children, 15 years older than Adrian. Even more disturbing, Blake discovered during his investigation that the relationship between Adrian and Nathaniel was not a simple affair. Nathaniel had used his position to help Adrian obtain several substantial commissions, and these transactions seemed to have serious ethical and legal issues. They were manipulating prices in some high-end real estate transactions, using Adrian's expertise and Nathaniel's influence to conduct insider trading. Blake closed the folder and took a deep breath. Tomorrow's surprise family meeting was obviously a trap. Combined with Adrian's recent phone records with lawyers and her parents' sudden coldness toward him, he could guess what was coming. He wasn't a workaholic, although the nature of his job required absences. Each time he returned home, he dedicated himself completely to family life and never missed any important activities of Mila's. He strived to be a good husband, and even during his periods working offshore, he made daily video calls. And Adrian had chosen to betray not just their marriage, but also professional ethics and legal boundaries. Blake opened his computer and sent an email to his lawyer, attaching copies of all the evidence. Then he sent a message to his most trusted colleague Marco. "Might need your help tomorrow. Keep your phone available." The following afternoon, Blake arrived punctually at his in-laws' house. Adrienne's father, George, a retired high school principal who had once been friendly to Blake, opened the door, but now his eyes showed only coldness. "Come in. Everyone's waiting for you," George said curtly. In the living room, Adrienne was sitting on the sofa, with her mother Helena beside her. At the dining table sat a middle-aged man Blake had never seen before, dressed in a suit with a briefcase in front of him. "Blake," Adrienne began, her voice surprisingly calm. "This is Attorney Warren. We need to talk." Warren took out a stack of documents from his briefcase and pushed them toward the coffee table in front of Blake. "This is the divorce agreement, with all terms already drafted. I recommend you sign it now to avoid unnecessary trouble and suffering." Blake glanced at the first page of the document. Division of property, child custody, alimony. All terms were extremely unfavorable to him. "If you refuse to sign," interrupted George with a threatening voice, "things will get very ugly. We have enough evidence to prove you're an incompetent father. You're frequently absent. Mila barely knows you. Sign this, or you'll regret it." The atmosphere in the room tensed. Adrienne avoided Blake's gaze, looking at her own fingers. Helena tightened her jaw, evidently already considering him an enemy. Blake felt a surge of anger, but he controlled himself. Slowly, he took out his own folder from his bag and smiled with satisfaction. "Actually, I have a surprise for you too," he said calmly. He opened the folder, took out a stack of photos and documents, and spread them on the coffee table, precisely covering the divorce agreement. Adrienne leaned forward, and her jaw dropped in shock when she saw the evidence. "What is this?" asked Helena in surprise, picking up a photo showing Adrienne and Nathaniel intimately embracing in a hotel lobby. "Your daughter and her lover," replied Blake, his voice calm but powerful. Nathaniel, married, 3 children, very influential in Houston's business circle. Their relationship has lasted at least 6 months. "This isn't what it looks like," stammered Adrienne, turning pale. Blake continued taking more evidence from the folder. "These are hotel receipts. These are text message records deleted but recovered from the cloud. These are bank statements showing suspicious transactions. Interestingly, these transactions coincide exactly with several questionable real estate deals." Attorney Warren shifted uncomfortably and reached out to take the documents. "Go ahead," said Blake. "My lawyer already has all the copies. In fact, this information has already been submitted to the Texas Bar Association and the Real Estate Commission." "Oh, and this," he took out a new document. "This is my divorce petition on grounds of spousal infidelity and possible professional misconduct. Considering this evidence, I trust the judge will make a fair decision on custody and property division." Adrienne's face lost all its color, and her hands began to tremble. "You can't do this," she murmured. "You'll ruin my career." "Like you tried to ruin my life?" Blake replied coldly. "I was never an incompetent father. I work to provide a stable life for our family. Every time I come home, I fully dedicate myself to family life. And you," he shook his head, "you chose to betray. Not just me, but also our daughter and your professional ethics." George and Helena sat there, too shocked to speak. Attorney Warren quickly gathered up the divorce agreement and whispered to Adrienne, "We need to reassess the situation." Just then, the doorbell rang. Blake stood up. "That should be Mila and my colleague Marco's family. I arranged for them to take Mila to the amusement park so she wouldn't have to witness all this. By the way, Marco's wife Elisa is an excellent child psychologist and will help Mila through this difficult period." In front of everyone's stunned gazes, Blake walked toward the door, but before leaving the living room, he turned to Adrienne and said, "You have 3 days to move out of our house. After that, my lawyer will contact you to discuss the divorce details. As for you," he looked at George and Helena, "if you want to see your granddaughter again, I suggest you reconsider your position." When he opened the front door, Mila's laughter came through, temporarily dispelling the tension in the room. Blake forced himself to smile, crouched down, and hugged his daughter. "Have fun, little princess," he told her. "Daddy will pick you up tonight." He watched Marco's car leave, and then turned to face the house he once considered family. Whatever happened next, he knew he had made the right decision. No one should tolerate betrayal, especially from those who are supposed to love you most. Blake walked back into the living room and found Adrienne already standing. The shock on her face transformed into anger. "You planned all this?" she accused him. "You investigated me? Spied on my phone? Don't make yourself the victim, Adrian. Blake responded coldly. Your charade is over. I'm just protecting myself and Mila. Attorney Warren was hurriedly gathering his documents, obviously anxious to leave this increasingly awkward situation. I'll be in contact with your lawyer, he told Blake, and quickly headed for the door. George finally found his voice. This can't be true. There must be a misunderstanding. Adrian wouldn't do something like this. Blake took out a bank statement from the folder. This is the expenditure record of your daughter and Nathaniel at the St. Regis Hotel near the Galleria last month. That same day, I was working on the oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. She told me she had gone to Austin for a real estate seminar. Helena covered her mouth, her eyes filled with shock and disappointment. This is just the tip of the iceberg, continued Blake. I have dozens of photos, hundreds of text messages, and the private investigator's report. But most serious are those real estate transactions. Nathaniel used his influence to help Adrian obtain several substantial commissions in return for her participation in some illegal operations. The Texas Real Estate Commission will be very interested in this. Adrian's face changed from anger to fear. You're bluffing, she said with a trembling voice. You have no evidence of any illegal conduct. Blake took out another document from the folder and pushed it toward her. These are the transaction records between Nathaniel's company and Horizon Investment. Look at the dates and amounts, and then look at the unusual commission you received 2 days later. Adrienne's legs seemed to lose strength, and she collapsed back onto the sofa. Her facade was beginning to crumble, replaced by a calculating expression. Fine, she finally said in a low voice. I made a mistake. But this won't affect my relationship with Mila. No judge will take custody away from a mother just for an extramarital affair. Perhaps not, admitted Blake. But they will consider whether a mother facing allegations of professional misconduct and even possible criminal charges is suitable for raising a child. And I have evidence that you've neglected Mila's needs on multiple occasions for your dates with Nathaniel. George stood up, his expression between anger and confusion. I think we all need to calm down. This is too sudden. It's not sudden at all for me, replied Blake, his voice calm but firm. I spent 3 months gathering evidence, making sure I fully understood what I was facing. I gave Adrian multiple opportunities to explain those suspicious behaviors, but she chose to lie and deceive. Now she must face the consequences. He turned to Adrian with a cold look. You have 3 days to leave my house. Anything you want to take must first be approved by my lawyer. You can see Mila under my supervision until the court makes formal arrangements. If you try to take her without permission, I'll call the police immediately. Adrienne's eyes flashed with fear, quickly replaced by a cold calculation. You'll regret this, Blake. You don't know how much influence Nathaniel has. Threatening me will only make your situation worse. Blake responded calmly. I'm prepared for any retaliation. In fact, I expect it. He picked up his folder and headed for the door. I'm going to pick up my daughter. I hope by tomorrow you'll have accepted reality. This marriage is over, Adrian. You ended it. As he left his in-laws' house, Blake felt a wave of relief. Despite the difficult legal battle and emotional trauma that lay ahead, he had taken the first step. He had exposed the lies and broken the carefully crafted charade Adrian had built. He drove to Marco's house to pick up Mila, thinking about how to explain to his 7-year-old daughter the changes that were coming. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was better than continuing to live amid lies and betrayal. Marco lived in a quiet neighborhood in West Houston. When Blake arrived, Mila was playing in the backyard with Marco's son. Everything okay? Marco asked quietly from the porch. Better than expected, replied Blake. She didn't expect I already knew everything. Marco nodded, his expression serious. What's your plan now? First ensure Mila is safe, then fight this case with everything I've got. I won't let Adrian take my daughter, and certainly not raise Mila with that scoundrel. If you need any help, Elisa and I are here, Marco said firmly. We can testify that you're a good father. And if needed, Elisa can provide professional opinion. Blake nodded gratefully. Thank you. I might need your help. When Mila noticed Blake, she ran to him and threw herself into his arms. Daddy, we went to the aquarium. I saw sharks and dolphins. Blake lifted his daughter, feeling an intense wave of protection. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Ready to go home? Mila nodded, but then asked, Where's Mommy? Is she coming home too? Blake exchanged a look with Marco, who took his own son inside, giving them some privacy. Mommy won't be coming home today, Blake said softly. Actually, we need to talk. Mommy and Daddy have some problems, and we might need to be apart for a while. Mila's little face wrinkled. Are you getting divorced? Like Emily's parents. Blake felt a pang of pain. Emily was one of Mila's classmates whose parents had recently divorced. Maybe, sweetheart. But this isn't your fault, okay? These are adult problems. No matter what happens, Daddy and Mommy both love you. Despite the resentment he felt toward Adrian, he knew he shouldn't speak ill of Mila's mother in front of her. Will I live with Mommy? Mila asked, her voice barely audible. We're not sure yet, Blake answered honestly. But you'll continue living in our house, at least for now. Mommy is going to move out for a while. On the way home, Blake observed Mila through the rearview mirror. She sat quietly in her child's seat, with a thoughtful expression. He knew this was just the beginning, with many difficult conversations ahead. Upon arriving home, he discovered that Adrienne's car was no longer in the garage. Entering the house, he noticed some of her personal effects were missing. The jewelry box from the dresser, several garments from the closet. Evidently, she had returned to take some essential items. Daddy, Mila asked, tugging at his hand. Where did Mommy go? Probably to Grandma's house, replied Blake, keeping his voice steady. Don't worry, she's fine. He checked the entire house to make sure Adrian hadn't taken any important documents or valuables. All original documents and evidence were secure in his safe, but he still felt uneasy. Adrian knew she had been caught, but Blake wasn't sure how she would react. Based on what he had learned about her recent behavior, she might do anything to protect herself. That night, he called his lawyer Sandra to tell her what had happened that afternoon. How did she react? Asked Sandra. First shock, then denial, and finally threats, replied Blake. I believe she'll seek help from Nathaniel. I need to be prepared for any counterattack. Wise decision, agreed Sandra. Nathaniel has a lot of influence in Houston. He might use his connections to cause you trouble. Is your job secure? Blake reflected for a moment. My company is international, not very tied to local politics. But I'll be vigilant. Tomorrow I'll file the documents with the court, said Sandra. We'll request a temporary restraining order to prevent her from taking Mila without permission. I'll also request a freeze on joint accounts to prevent her from withdrawing funds. Blake nodded gratefully, though Sandra couldn't see him. One more thing, he added. I suspect the relationship between Adrian and Nathaniel involves some questionable real estate transactions. What can we do about that? I'll contact a colleague who specializes in white-collar crime, Sandra replied. If there is indeed fraud or other illegal conduct, that will greatly influence the custody dispute. After hanging up, Blake checked on Mila's room. She was already asleep, hugging her favorite teddy bear. He gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead and returned to his bedroom. Looking at the empty side of the bed, he felt a strange relief. Although the pain and anger persisted, at least the lies had ended. The next morning, as Blake was preparing breakfast for Mila, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw Nathaniel standing at the door, impeccably dressed in a suit with a serious expression. Blake took a deep breath, opened the door just a crack, making sure Nathaniel couldn't see inside. What do you want? He asked coldly. We need to talk. Nathaniel's voice was deep and calm. Resolve this like civilized people. There's nothing to talk about, replied Blake. You and my wife betrayed me, and now you'll both face the consequences. Nathaniel's expression darkened. You don't know what trouble you're getting into. I can make it impossible for you to move in this city. Try it, responded Blake, not backing down. I've already handed all the evidence to my lawyer and the relevant authorities. If you try to retaliate, you'll only make your situation worse. Listen, Nathaniel's voice softened a bit. I know you're angry, and that's understandable. But we can reach an agreement that benefits everyone. My reputation is important to me, and to Adrian too. If these photos and allegations become public, are you offering me a bribe? Interrupted Blake, his voice filled with contempt. Now get off my doorstep, or I'll call the police for harassing my daughter and me. Nathaniel's face turned livid, and he stepped forward, but Blake didn't move. You'll regret this, he warned. No, Blake said calmly. You and Adrian will regret it. Now please leave, my daughter is having breakfast. He closed the door, locked it, and watched through the window as Nathaniel left. The man walked angrily to his Mercedes, slammed the door, and quickly drove away. Blake returned to the kitchen where Mila was watching him curiously. Who was that, Daddy? Just a salesman, he lied casually. Come on, when you finish breakfast, we'll go to the park, okay? The following days were filled with legal documents and emotional conversations. Sandra filed the divorce petition and temporary custody request with the court. Blake received a series of emails and calls from Adrienne's new lawyer requesting mediation, but he firmly rejected any form of settlement. "I just want a fair divorce and full custody of Mila," he told Sandra. "I won't accept any compromise." Sandra showed understanding, but also reminded him that Texas courts generally favor joint custody. Unless there's compelling evidence that the mother is unfit, it's difficult to obtain full custody. "Then find that evidence," Blake said firmly. "Investigate every transaction between her and Nathaniel if necessary." Meanwhile, Blake had to deal with sudden changes at work. His boss informed him that the company had decided to cancel his offshore rotation next month and transfer him to an office on land. The reason was restructuring, but Blake suspected it was the result of Nathaniel's influence. Despite this, he wasn't discouraged. The land-based work was actually more favorable for his custody battle for Mila, and he had already contacted several friends in the industry, quietly looking for new job opportunities just in case. A week later, the first court hearing arrived. Blake and Sandra arrived early at the courthouse and found Adrienne and her lawyer Victoria already waiting. Adrienne still looked elegant, but in her eyes sparkled a calculating coldness that Blake had never seen before. "Ready?" asked Sandra, organizing her documents. Blake nodded, looking straight ahead, refusing to be disturbed by Adrienne's presence. "Completely ready." As they entered the courtroom, Blake noticed Nathaniel sitting in the back row of the gallery. Evidently, he wanted to see firsthand how things unfolded. Blake deliberately ignored him, focusing on the imminent hearing. The main purpose of this preliminary hearing was to determine temporary custody arrangements and property freezing issues. When the judge entered the courtroom, the procedure formally began. Adrienne's lawyer Victoria spoke first, trying to portray Blake as a frequently absent father away from home for work, while Adrienne was the primary caregiver. She skillfully avoided mentioning the infidelity, focusing on Blake's work arrangements. When it was Sandra's turn to speak, she was straightforward. "Your Honor, my client has substantial evidence that the opposing party not only had an extramarital affair, but also engaged in professional misconduct that could constitute criminal offenses." She handed over a document. "These are copies of photographs and communication records that clearly show the inappropriate relationship between Mrs. Adrienne and Mr. Nathaniel." The judge reviewed the documents with a serious expression. "These are certainly disturbing, but infidelity alone does not determine custody issues." "We completely agree, Your Honor," continued Sandra. "But please turn to page 7. These bank records and transaction documents suggest that Mrs. Adrienne and Mr. Nathaniel might be involved in real estate fraud. My client is concerned that this improper conduct and the possible legal consequences would negatively impact the child." Victoria immediately stood to object. "These are unsubstantiated allegations, Your Honor. There are no formal investigations or charges supporting these claims." The judge raised a hand. "I understand your objection, but these documents raise legitimate concerns." He turned to Adrienne. "Mrs. Adrienne, how do you respond to these allegations?" Adrienne stood up, her voice calm and confident. "Your Honor, I deny any misconduct. Yes, I admit I made a mistake in betraying my marriage, but that shouldn't affect my rights as a mother. As for those alleged fraud accusations, they are completely misinterpretations of legitimate business transactions." Blake noticed how skillful her performance was, perfectly combining sincere remorse with firm self-defense. But he also noticed that when the judge mentioned the bank records, her right hand trembled slightly. After 2 hours of statements and questioning, the judge announced a 10-minute recess to consider his decision. Blake stood in the hallway, seeing Nathaniel staring at him from a distance, threat in his eyes. When the hearing resumed, the judge announced his decision. "Considering the current evidence, this court grants temporary joint custody to both parties until the final trial, with primary residence at the father's home and visitation rights for the mother on weekends. The allegations of financial misconduct will be referred to the relevant authorities for investigation. Furthermore, the court orders all joint accounts frozen until the final judgment." It wasn't the full custody Blake had hoped for, but considering the legal tendencies in Texas, it was a relatively favorable outcome. At least Mila would live primarily with him, and Adrienne's activities would be restricted. Leaving the courtroom, Blake saw Adrienne and Nathaniel whispering at the end of the hallway, with tense expressions. When they noticed Blake's gaze, they quickly separated. Sandra put a hand on Blake's shoulder. This is just the first step. We'll continue collecting evidence, especially about those real estate transactions. If we can prove she's involved in fraud, the court is very likely to support your full custody in the final judgment. Blake nodded, feeling both exhausted and relieved. Thank you, Sandra. We'll keep moving forward. He headed to the parking lot to pick up Mila, who was spending this day full of legal proceedings at Marco's house. When he reached his car, he found a note stuck to the windshield. This is just the beginning. You will lose everything. Blake tore off the note, folded it expressionlessly, and put it in his pocket. If Nathaniel thought such threats would intimidate him, he was very wrong. This would only strengthen Blake's determination to fight to the end. 3 months passed, and the battle continued. Adrienne punctually picked up Mila every weekend, acting like the perfect mother, but Blake could piece together the truth from Mila's words upon returning. These weekends typically included shopping sprees, overindulgence, and numerous hints about "Daddy separated us." Blake didn't counter these manipulations, but instead focused on providing a stable environment for Mila. He had completely transferred to land-based work so he could return home every day. He found an excellent therapist nearby to help Mila process the emotional impact of her parents' divorce. Every night, he read with Mila, striving to create good memories to balance this difficult period. Meanwhile, the legal investigations began to yield results. The Texas Real Estate Commission formally launched an investigation into Adrienne and Nathaniel. And more shockingly, the FBI also showed interest in some of their transactions. Evidently, the irregularities were more serious than Blake had initially imagined. Nathaniel's company began to distance itself from him. He was suspended indefinitely pending the investigation results. His wife Cecilia had filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order against him. Clearly, Blake wasn't his only victim. One Friday afternoon, as Blake was preparing Mila's weekend bag for Adrienne's visit, the phone rang. It was Sandra. There are major developments. Her voice was full of excitement. The FBI raided Nathaniel's office and home this morning. Apparently, they found enough evidence to take immediate action. Blake sat down, surprised by the rapid developments. What does this mean? It means our allegations about professional misconduct have been confirmed and probably are more serious than we thought. Nathaniel might face serious federal charges. What about Adrienne? Sandra paused. She's also under investigation. I don't know the specific details, but this is very favorable for our case. I'll immediately file a motion to modify custody. Just as Blake hung up, the doorbell rang. He opened the door and saw Adrienne, whose perfect makeup and clothing couldn't hide the tension in her eyes. I'm here to pick up Mila, she said, deliberately keeping her voice calm. Blake nodded and let her in, but didn't mention the FBI raid. If she knew, she certainly wouldn't be so calm. Mila is just finishing packing her last few things. Adrienne lingered in the foyer, obviously not wanting to venture deeper into the house that was once hers. I plan to take her to the zoo, she said, trying to fill the awkward silence. She'll love that, Blake replied briefly. Mila ran downstairs with her little pink backpack. Mommy. She ran to Adrienne and gave her a hug. Hi, sweetheart. Adrienne's voice suddenly turned soft and loving. Ready for adventure? Blake watched the scene, complex emotions in his heart. Although Adrienne had betrayed him, she was still Mila's mother. For his daughter's sake, he had to maintain civility. Bring her back before 7 on Sunday. He reminded her. She has school on Monday. Adrienne nodded and took Mila's hand, heading toward the door. Just as they were about to leave, Blake's phone rang again. It was an unknown number. Blake, asked a formal male voice. Yes, that's me. This is Agent Rodriguez from the FBI. Today we conducted a raid on the properties of Nathaniel and several accomplices. We need to speak with you as soon as possible, as your wife Adrienne is one of the subjects of the investigation. Blake looked at Adrienne, who was at the door and had evidently heard the content of the call, turning pale. I understand, replied Blake. When can I cooperate with the investigation? We're heading to your residence, expecting to arrive in 20 minutes. If your wife is currently present, please ask her to stay. Blake hung up and looked directly into Adrienne's eyes. You heard that. FBI agents are coming here. They want to talk to both of us." Adrienne's confidence completely collapsed. She let go of Mila's hand, and her body swayed. They searched Nathaniel's office and his home. Apparently, they found enough evidence to act. Mila looked confusedly at both parents. "What's happening? Aren't we going to the zoo?" Blake crouched down and gently stroked his daughter's hair. "Sweetie, Mommy might not be able to take you to the zoo today. There are important matters to attend to." He took out his phone. "I'll call Uncle Marco to see if you can go play with Connor." As Blake made the call, Adrienne collapsed on the sofa, covering her face with her hands. "This can't be happening," she murmured. Nathaniel said he had taken care of everything. Blake hung up and turned to Adrienne. "Marco will come pick up Mila. You'd better prepare yourself, because if the FBI already has enough evidence to conduct a raid, things look very bad for you." Adrienne suddenly lifted her head, fear and anger mixed in her eyes. "This is all your fault. If you had just quietly signed that divorce agreement, none of this would have happened." "No, Adrienne," Blake responded calmly. "It's your and Nathaniel's fault. You chose to deceive and act illegally. Now you must face the consequences." 5 minutes later, Marco arrived, and Blake briefly explained the situation. "Just some legal issues," he whispered where Mila couldn't hear. "Could take several hours." Marco nodded understandingly and took Mila away, promising to look after her until Blake could pick her up. The FBI agents arrived punctually, 2 men and a woman, dressed in impeccable suits with serious expressions. They presented their credentials and a search warrant. "We need to search the house, especially any place that might contain documents related to Horizon Investment and Crystal Peak Development," explained Agent Rodriguez. Blake nodded in understanding. "I'll cooperate. But I should clarify that all documents related to my ex-wife's business were taken when she moved out." Adrienne was sitting on the sofa, appearing defeated. Agent Ramirez sat beside her and began asking questions, while the other 2 agents started searching the house. Blake sat at the dining table, observing everything. He felt no malicious joy, only a strange emptiness. The woman he once loved, the mother of his daughter, might now face serious criminal charges. Although he was angry about her betrayal, seeing her life crumble was still painful. The search lasted 3 hours. The agents took photos of the home office, collected several folders, and an old laptop. They documented Adrienne's statements in detail, then informed her she should report to the FBI office the next morning for further questioning. "You can come on your own," Agent Rodriguez told her, "but I advise bringing a lawyer. The situation appears quite serious." Adrienne nodded mechanically, tears glistening in her eyes. When the FBI agents left, she remained sitting on the sofa, looking completely lost. "You should go," Blake said quietly. "I need to pick up Mila." Adrienne raised her head, her gaze empty. "He deceived me," she said softly. "Nathaniel. He said these transactions were legal, just edge operations. He said we'd never get caught." Blake showed no compassion. "You're a licensed real estate agent, Adrienne. You should know what's legal and what's not. Don't try to blame everything on Nathaniel." "Will I go to prison?" she asked with a trembling voice. "I don't know," Blake answered honestly. "It depends on how deeply involved you are and whether you're willing to cooperate with the investigation." Adrienne stood up, wiping away her tears. "What about Mila? If I'm sentenced, what will happen to her?" "She'll be fine," Blake said firmly. "I'll make sure of that. Whatever happens, she'll be protected and cared for." Adrienne nodded and headed toward the door. Before leaving, she turned around. "I'm sorry, Blake. Not just for the transactions, but for the betrayal. I thought I had fallen in love with Nathaniel, but now I realize he was just using me." Blake didn't respond to her apology. "Goodbye, Adrienne. Think carefully about your options before seeing your lawyer tomorrow." When she left, Blake felt a strong surge of emotions: anger, sadness, relief, and a strange calmness. The scars of betrayal remained, but now justice was being realized. The following weeks became a media storm. Nathaniel and several of his business partners, including Adrienne, were arrested on multiple charges: real estate fraud, money laundering, document forgery, tax evasion. The investigation revealed a complex scheme involving millions of dollars and dozens of properties. Adrienne agreed to testify against Nathaniel in a plea deal in exchange for a lighter sentence. She lost her real estate license and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But as it was her first offense and she cooperated with the investigation, Her actual serving time might be just over a year. For Blake, these developments meant an absolute advantage in the custody dispute. The court quickly granted him full legal custody of Mila, with limited supervised visitation for Adrian, and only after she served her sentence. The final divorce settlement was very favorable to Blake. Due to Adrienne's criminal conduct, the court determined she was not entitled to any alimony or property division. The house and most of the common property went to Blake, although some assets were seized to compensate victims of Adrienne's fraud. Nathaniel's fate was more severe. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, lost all his professional licenses, and his company went bankrupt. His wife Cecilia took most of his remaining legal assets in the divorce, and his 3 children refused to see him. For Blake, the hardest part was explaining to Mila why her mother had to go to a special place for a while. With Elisa's help, he explained the situation in the most appropriate way for a 7-year-old child. "Mommy made some mistakes," he told Mila, "and she needs to go to a place to receive her punishment. It's like when you do something wrong and have to face the consequences. Only for adults the consequences are more serious." Mila didn't fully understand, but she accepted the explanation. Blake arranged weekly sessions with a psychologist to help her process these changes. He also ensured that Mila could maintain contact with her mother through video calls and letters. A year and a half later, when Adrienne completed her sentence and was released from prison, she was a changed person. Prison life and public humiliation had destroyed her former arrogance. She moved into a small apartment, subsisting on an administrative assistant job, and began striving to rebuild her relationship with her daughter. Blake allowed her to meet with Mila under supervision, but he always remained vigilant. He would never forgive Adrienne's betrayal, nor would he trust her again. For him, some wounds were too deep to heal, some betrayals too severe to be forgiven. 2 years later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Blake and Mila were having breakfast in the backyard. Mila, now 9 years old, had adapted to the new rhythm of life. Weekdays and Saturdays with her father, brief meetings with her mother on Sunday afternoons. "Daddy," Mila suddenly asked, "do you hate Mommy?" Blake put down his coffee cup, seriously considering the question. "No, sweetheart, I don't hate her. I'm angry and disappointed about what she did, but I don't hate the person. Will you forgive her?" Blake shook his head. "There are things that cannot be forgiven, Mila. But that doesn't mean I'll prevent you from loving her or having a relationship with her. She's still your mother." Mila nodded, seeming to reflect on this answer. "Thompson says forgiveness is for yourself, not for others." Blake smiled slightly. Thompson was Mila's school counselor, a wise old woman. That's true for many situations. But sometimes, not forgiving is also a form of strength. It reminds us to respect ourselves, set boundaries, and not allow others to hurt us again. He reached out to stroke his daughter's hair. "What's important is that you know, no matter what happens, I will always love and protect you." Mila smiled and continued with her breakfast. Blake looked toward the trees at the end of the yard, reflecting on the journey of the past few years. His marriage had ended with betrayal, but his life hadn't stagnated because of it. He had started a new professional stage, created a stable family environment, and raised a healthy, happy daughter. The scars of betrayal might never completely disappear, but they no longer defined each of his days. He chose not to forgive, but he also chose not to be controlled by hatred. He chose to look forward, but never forget the lessons of the past. This is the price of betrayal, not just the punishment for the betrayers, but also the permanent change in those betrayed. Adrienne and Nathaniel paid their deserved price: loss of freedom, career, reputation, and relationships. And Blake, although he lost the marriage he once believed in, won the most important battle, protecting his and his daughter's future, refusing to let betrayal define their lives. As Mila began telling stories about school again, Blake listened with a smile. The sunlight warmed them, and a new day unfolded its possibilities. This family had weathered the storm, and now, even with scars, they had found the strength to move forward. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating content. We look forward to seeing you in our next story.